Now that Legions Imperialis has finally landed after its initial delays, and that my own copy after its own short delay has arrived, and hopefully there's not too many of you out there who are left unable to get a set or still waiting on their own copies, but now the miniatures are here, I can start painting them. And with that comes its own questions: what legion do I choose, and how to go about painting miniatures so small, what's the most efficient way of doing it, how much detail to add. With that in mind, I've decided to record two painting tutorials, one covering the 9 Traitor Legions and this video covering the 9 Loyalist Legions. Welcome to Miniature Realms, my name's Stuart, and in this video I'm going to take you through how to paint the 9 Loyalist Legions in a relatively quick time and using simple methods. As with any tutorial, these are just a set of ideas. They're not best practice, they're not the right way to do it, they're just a way of doing it. So please watch the video and enjoy it and take from it what you will. I'm going to try and make it as accessible as possible. I am using an airbrush at stages in this tutorial, but I will talk through how to achieve a similar effect without the airbrush. And there will also be stages that you may decide to leave out. So I go back and highlight most of these Marines after the initial base layer stage. You don't have to do that, and this is a really good way of simplifying your scheme and speeding it up just to remove those stages. And again, I will talk about that a little as we go through the video. Most of the paints in this tutorial are from Games Workshops Citadel range. I've decided to stick with mostly contrast rather than the alternatives from Army Painter and Vallejo. As good as they are, I just wanted to go with something that was easily recognisable and accessible for new players out there who may have just picked up this game. For that reason, I've also used, where possible, Citadel colours as later highlights. I do move away from Citadel colours a few occasions, and where I do, I will offer up a Citadel alternative where possible. I've started each miniature with a black prime, and I'll just be painting one single miniature on these bases here. So starting with Dark Angels, and the first paint is Incubi Darkness, which is a base paint from the Citadel range, and I'm going to be giving a very light dry brush over a black base. This is an extremely light dry brush. I'm very much just tickling the miniature, trying to pick out any of the little edges to the tops of the armour and just give that slight idea that there's a highlight or light catching on the black. Now for the first contrast paint, and this is Contrast Black Legion, which seems a bizarre thing to do when the miniature is looking so black, but I'm painting in the gun again now and the exhaust manifolds on the back of the backpack. This, as you can see, when I do add it, really does dull it back down again, which sort of further highlights how much of a difference that light dry brush of Incubi Darkness actually made. Now we head to the first non-Citadel colour that I'm using, which is Game Silver from Vallejo. If you're going to stick with Citadel paints, I think the closest thing you could aim for would be Iron Hand Steel. Again here we are dry brushing, and I'm just doing the lightest little tickle, mostly aiming at the bolt gun itself, but also using it just to pick up a few of the edges around the tops of the backpack and the armour, just to look like where paint has worn away. This is really useful on miniatures that are black, because it really helps pick out that definition so it doesn't just look like a primed miniature. Now using the same colour but not with a dry brush, I'm just picking out the exhaust manifolds on that backpack again, and just some highlighted areas on the tops and edges of that bolt gun just to really make it stand out. Now it's Citadel Mephiston Red base. I'm using this on my palette with a touch of water just to thin it down, and I'll be using this to add some spot colour to pick out the reds that you see on the Dark Angels. Now if they were in a different style of armour, so if it was Mark III armour, they're likely to have an Aquila or something like that on the chest of the front. These have cross belts, but I've still decided to paint the tops of the cross belt red just to add that idea of red colour to the miniature. You really want these to stand out and be recognisable as Dark Angels and not confused with Raven Guard or Iron Hands or something like that. With that in mind, you can see me here on the shoulder pad without any decals for any of these miniatures. I'm just painting a marking that looks a little bit like the Dark Angels symbol. It doesn't have to be perfect, but from a distance should just contain the right shape. Now, very hard to film and photograph, but what you see there is a very quick but effective Dark Angels Legionary, and on a base with all of these friends with the base all nicely painted, these will look just fantastic. Now we move on to white scars, and now to start with I'm going to be using the airbrush again to do a matte grey coverage. Now if you don't have an airbrush, what I suggest you do is paint these miniatures in a grey primer rather than starting with black. Because the miniature is going to be white, I'm doing a fairly full coverage all over. I'm not worried if a little bit of the black stays in the undercuts. But a solid base for the next stage, which is bold Britannian white from Pro Acryl in this case, is what you really need. Now I did say I would offer a Citadel alternative to each paint. I find that very hard to do with Citadel white paints. I'm really not a fan of them, but Corax white is, I'm sure, is the go-to, but I would recommend trying to pick up a white paint from most other brands, because the Citadel ones unfortunately are a little bit lacking. Now you have that nice smooth white layer, you can move on to contrast apothecary white, and I'm thinning it 50-50 here with medium. I've got the express colour version there, but the Citadel version will work just as well. It just happened to be what I had at hand. I'm applying it to the whole miniature, making sure that it runs into all those crevices, and essentially what this is a glaze or a bit of a wash or a shade, if you want to call it that, where it's grey in colour. When it settles in all those gaps, it makes the white look shaded. This is one of those absolutely optional stages, and you could leave it as it is and carry on with the next stages, but I'm going back and I'm just going over those white areas, so the tops of the armour panels, and just adding a bit of clear white back to really make it pop and stand out. I'm using the Pro Acryl titanium white here. There are lots of good whites around. The Vallejo ranges are fantastic. The model colour off-white is a very good one. The Game Air white is a very good one. There's plenty around, so do try some other things, but the titanium white here is just essentially highlighting over the areas where the glaze from the apothecary white has gone over and dulled it slightly. As with the previous miniature, I'm going to be using contrast black Legion on the bolt gun and also on the exhaust manifolds of the backpack. Now it's time for some spot colours to make this miniature look like a member of the White Scars Legion rather than just generic white armour. I'm using contrast Blood Angels Red, which we're able to do because we're working on top of a white paint job. If I was using a different colour, I'd probably use something like Mephiston Red. Because we're going on top of the white, we can use the contrast, which is a little bit easier to control for detail work. So painting one foot and the bottom of the leg here in red, putting some little arrows on, and we can use it to pick out some other details as well. Here I add a little triangle to the back of the backpack, then a very quick zigzag pattern on the shoulder pad to look like the Legion symbol. As with the previous miniature, I'm using Game Air Silver again. Remember, you can swap that out for Iron Hand Steel. I'm just doing the lightest tickle of dry brushes again, focusing around the bolt gun on the edges of those exhaust manifolds, but not worrying if there's a little bit that goes on the top of the backpack, so just like paint has been worn away in the heat of battle. And then again, as we did before, using a more detailed brush just to pick out some little elements with the same coloured silver paint. So here I'm just picking out the studs on the left shoulder pad. And there we have a completed white scar, a little bit easier to video and to photograph, so you may have a slightly better idea than you did with the previous one. Those little red accents on there really just give you the idea that it's a white scar rather than any other legionary, and I think they look pretty cool. Now we move on to the Space Wolves, and I'm returning with the Army Painter Matte Grey Primer through the airbrush. I'm going a little bit lighter here than I did with the White Scars. I'm not looking for a base here of which to apply white afterwards, so I don't mind if some of the black shows through. If you're not using an airbrush and you wanted to just paint by hand, Esching Grey from Citadel would be a very good option to go for. It's a duller grey, which would be perfect for this. You could do a very heavy dry brush overall, almost covering the whole miniature, using something like a makeup brush would be a really good technique for this, or you could just paint in the grey flat if you wanted to. So with that slightly almost zenithal approach to the grey that I've used, I'm going to dull it down with some basilicanium grey and provide some shadow. I'm thinning this again 50-50 with medium and applying it over the whole miniature. And what you'll see there is it slightly dulls the lighter areas of the grey and sits in all those recesses and gives you this nice Horus Heresy style Space Wolves dull grey rather than the bluish grey that you see in 40k era Marines. As before, we grab the contrast black Legion and pick out the bolt gun and those manifolds. Returning again to Game Air Silver, again if you want to stick to Citadel paints you could use Iron Hand Steel or Runefang Steel, or even Stormhost Silver might be a little bit too light, but if you have any of those paints in your range there will be decent substitutions for this. Being super light again with the dry brushing, almost tickling it. I'm trying to just do it from the top down direction. I don't want to obliterate this as the miniatures are so small, and too much will make it look quite bad quite fast. Then back to those spot colours again, which really just make the Legion look like the Legion from a distance rather than just a grey Space Marine. And I'm using Mephiston Red again as I did before, working on that right shoulder pad. And I'm just making a shape that from a distance is a close approximation of the Space Wolves logo. In addition to that, I decided to paint the nose of this Beaky Marine red as well. You can have irregular markings on these. There's loads of artwork and things online that you can really draw upon. You don't have to do too much Googling to find lots of awesome reference material. A little bit like the white scar, I've decided to add a few marks to the bottom of the right leg. There we have our miniature Space Wolf. Pretty easy to do, no advanced techniques here. All of those airbrushing techniques can be changed for others and you'll get a very similar result. And I think there can be quite an effective looking army. Definitely one that's maybe in the mix for me. So now we move on to Imperial Fists, and a slight change from the other miniatures. So now we're working on those black prime miniatures, and I'm using that Pro Acryl titanium white through the airbrush as a very heavy zenithal. So essentially we're underpainting here. I'm adding white, mostly top down, but I'm making sure I cover the sides as well. So we've got a nice base for those contrast paints. And then following up with that same Pro Acryl, and I'm dry brushing just to pick out some of the edges, which really helps with that glazing technique. Now that that miniature is fully prepared in that almost white grayscale, it's time to start with the contrast, and we have Nazdrag Yellow. There are quite a few yellows available in the contrast range, and more than one of them is suitable. So have a little play around yourself. I prefer this one. It's got a sort of deeper, warmer, ochre tone to it, and I find that in the recesses this gives you a really nice natural shade. And if you want, you could even use a clean white brush to remove it from the flatter surfaces to kind of give you that highlight, but I feel it works pretty well just to slap it on at this stage. Again, we return to Contrast Black Legion to pick out the bolt gun and to pick out the exhaust manifolds. You can see here I'm also using the Black Legion just to pick out those studs on the left shoulder pad. Now we move on to those optional highlight layers. You really don't need to do this, but I'm deciding to use some Phalanx Yellow from Citadel. This just really goes on those flatter areas, so the bridge of the nose, the top of the helmet, on some of the shoulder pads, tops of the legs, things like that. This does take time, obviously. This is more of an advanced level, even though this is still very much a tabletop level. I'm not Richard Gray here, but if you want to miss these areas out, you can. You could also just dry brush this area on rather than painting it in the way I am here. If you're going to do that, I would suggest you do that before you paint in the guns and the exhaust manifolds, etc, etc. You can be quite limited with these highlights. I'm adding them here just to little lines on the top of the backpack, and I just find it really accentuates those darker shaded areas when you add to the highlight. It just reinforces what that contrast paint has already done for you. And the same thing with the bottoms of the legs as well. You don't have to do the whole thing, you could just do where the light would catch. Back to the Game Air Silver for the next stage, or for whatever Citadel light bright silver colour, or whatever other brand of light bright silver colour you wish to use. And again, we're doing that very subtle light tickle of a dry brush, focusing around the top of the bolt gun, but also around the backpack and things as well, just to make it look a little bit weathered and worn, and it acts a little bit like an edge highlight. No spot colours as such with this miniature, but I'm using a little bit of that Black Legion contrast paint just to paint in a couple of blobs that look a little bit like the fist for the Imperial Fist logo. And here you have your Imperial Fist, which is very often my Legion to go to, and I've been thinking about doing something different, but the yellow does work very well at this scale and it does really stand out, and I'm sure they'll look pretty great on the table. Let me know what you think. Now moving swiftly on to the Blood Angels, and these are prepared exactly the same way as the Imperial Fist, so that heavy underpainting zenithal of white, including the dry brush. Again, if you don't have an airbrush, you could go with grey and then a dry brush white, or even just prime in flat white. Now I'm using Blood Angels contrast red, so no surprise there. You could use Flesh Tearers red as well. They are both viable options for this scale of miniature for Blood Angels. I'll be using the Flesh Tearers red more in the second video when I cover the Traitor Legions. If If you are enjoying the video and you'd like to support the channel, I do have a Patreon. There's a link in the description for that. There are multiple levels, some that have painting tuition and freebies involved, some that are just supporting the channel. There is a Discord for patrons and for free as well. There are 2 levels to that, so if you just want to get involved and chat painting, don't want to join the Patreon, that's a really cool way of supporting the channel as well. Returning yet again to the Contrast Black Legion, as you're probably getting the hang of things now, we're placing that on the bolt gun and on those exhaust manifolds around the back, not forgetting to pick out those studs on that left shoulder pad. The red looks great as it is, but if you want to go down the route of that additional highlight, you can. I'm using Evil Sun Scarlet here. Now you're just picking out the flatter areas on the tops of the shoulder pads and on the helmet, and just really kind of tidying it up and making it pop a little bit more. I've decided to make these red highlights pop even further, and I've mixed a little bit of Wildlight red in with the Evil Suns just on the very edges of the shoulder pad here and on the tops of the helmets. And again, these are stages you may decide not to do, or you may decide to do it as a very light dry brush. Again, if you do that, make sure that you do it before you paint in the weapon, otherwise you just have to go back and fix those afterwards. And we're back to the silver dry brush highlight for the bolt guns on the top of those exhaust manifolds. Much like the Imperial Fist, I'm using the Black Legion here just to paint, in this case, a little Blood Angel's blood drop on that right shoulder. And there we have our finished Blood Angel. Again, those extra optional highlights really are up to you. Don't feel pressured to do them. I'm not sure what level I will get to when I paint a whole armor myself, but I wanted to just experiment a little bit and see how well the miniatures took the highlight, and it does seem to make them pop. Now we're on to Iron Hands, and we have a Black Prime miniature and we have black metal from scale 75. Something like Iron Warriors would be the perfect Citadel alternative, and if you're using other paint ranges, your best gun metal alternative would be what you're looking for here. They're sometimes described as metallic, sometimes described as black, and you really want them to stand out from the Dark Angels or the Raven Guard, etc, etc. And it's quite hard to do when you're sticking to a very dull black scheme. So I've decided here just to painting the shoulder pads as this dull silver and do some highlighting, which we'll see afterwards. When I paint these in 28mm for a regular client of mine, I make them look very different. I actually use some colour shift metallics, and there's been lots of alternative schemes for many people over the years, just trying to make that black stand out a little bit more. But I wanted to make sure that I kept this tutorial a little bit more traditional rather than using an alternative scheme. But still sticking to the light silver as the dry brush afterwards. Again, being super light with this, I don't want to obliterate the black, I really just want to pick up on the edges. So you're highlighting the edges of the black here, and also the gunmetal colours, in this case scale colour black metal at the same time. So heading back to that bold titanium white, and like with the other legions, I'm just doing a faint approximation of the legion symbol on the right shoulder pad. And there's the finished Iron Hand, one of the most simple paint schemes you will find. And if you're looking to get an army on the table as quick as possible, these may be the ones for you. Again, quite hard to photograph in video, so I hope you can see the miniature and the way it's come out. Moving swiftly on to the Ultramarines, and again these are prepared exactly the same way as the Imperial Fists and the Blood Angels, so we have that white Zenithal pre-highlight, pre-shade underpainting with the dry brushing. So for the base layer here, I'm using Contrast Sermon Blue, which is quite a vibrant blue, but not too bright, a little bit towards the bright side of the mid-tone, I would say. And it's a really nice coverage. It settles in the recesses very nicely, and it's quite dark where it does so it gives you that natural shade, but does leave the higher areas with that good highlight effect as well. It's one of the perfect contrast paints for doing what it was designed to do in terms of the description of it, as in that one coat paint. So for painting an army to get on the table in this scale, this could be another one of those really easy legions for you that ends up looking fantastic. And I'm sure you've guessed it already, we're straight in with the Contrast Black Legion to pick out the bolt gun and those exhaust manifolds. Then we can move into those optional highlights, and here I'm using Layer Techlist Blue, and I'm just picking out, just as I did before, some of those high point areas where the light would catch, so the tops of the helmets, going around the tops and the edges of the shoulder pads and the knees and things like that. As I was playing, I decided I want to push that highlight even further, and I'm using a Joriald in turquoise from Scale 75 Fantasy Range colours. Something like Lothern Blue from the Citadel range will be a good substitute for this. But again, I'm just playing around at this stage, seeing how well they pop once I add the further highlights. Whether I want to do this on every single Marine in a large army, I'm not sure. So take what you want from these tutorials. I'm just giving you a little bit of an idea how these miniatures will stand when you paint them almost in a traditional way. With those highlights added, it's time to return to Game Air Silver for those subtle dry brushes in the same places as before. Very, very gentle, almost top down, grabbing the end of the bolt gun and the chain blade that's there and just brushing along the top of the backpack to make it look like it's a bit worn and weathered. Again here, opting for the Pro Acryl Bold Titanium White, and I'm just painting in that Ultramarines logo on the right shoulder pad. And here's the finished Ultramarine, and like I said, if you wanted to skip those highlight layers or even dry brush them on, you could absolutely do that. I just wanted to play around and see what they went like here. Down to the final two now, and here we are with the Salamanders. The prep again is exactly the same for the Imperial Fists, the Blood Angels, the Ultramarines. The base colour layer this time being contrast Orc Flesh. This is a very nice mid-green which works very well as an all-over coat, just the same way as the Nazdrang Yellow, the Yasarmen Blue, the Blood Angels Red did on those respective legions. As before, we head to the contrast Black Legion to pick out that bolt gun and those exhaust manifolds. In addition to this, the Salamanders tend to have black shoulder pads, so I'm painting over the green here with the same Black Legion. And yes, we're here with the optional highlighting stages, and I'm using Warpstone Glow from Citadel first, exactly the same way as before, just picking out and accentuating those highlighted areas. I decided to add just a tiny touch of white afterwards to the same green, just to really make those top highlights pop. Again, do as much or as little as you want in those areas. We're back to the dry brushing with the Game Air Silver again. Much the same as before, just doing that very, very light tickle of a dry brush to on the bolt gun itself, just to make it look metallic, and just making sure you're dragging across the top of that backpack as well. Using a touch of that titanium white on that right shoulder pad again, this time for the Salamanders Legion symbol. And there we have our finished Salamander, and I think the mixture between the green and the black and the little white emblem on the shoulder really makes them stand out on the tabletop. Now onto the final legion of this tutorial, and it's the Raven Guard, and I'm using some Storm Vermin Fur. And this is again an extremely light dry brush. I'm just trying to pick up the edges of the miniature. I don't want it to get on the flats of the surfaces much at all. This miniature should look like it's black. The whole idea of the Raven Guard is that they did a lot of covert missions and their armour was black. There wasn't many bright accents or anything like that at all. Maybe a bit of silver, maybe a little bit of white, but essentially they were dull and black, which is easy to paint but also hard to make them stand out and look painted. So I figured this was a way of just adding a little bit of texture and a little bit of a highlight to the miniature. Once that was done, I've got Game Air Silver and Black Metal, so whichever metallics you've been using throughout the tutorial. The duller one first, so I'm painting in the weapons and the exhaust manifolds as we did with the Iron Hands. And then onto that lighter silver just to really make those metal areas pop. So I'm concentrating on the end of the bolt gun here and the top of the exhaust manifolds. And something I didn't do here was the dry brush, which I've been doing on the previous miniatures. The dry brush in grey for me was enough for the black. I want the black to look different to the Iron Hands black. I want to look different to the Dark Angels black, and this was one of the ways of making it different and stand out from the others. And then reaching for the titanium white again, I'm just painting on something that looks a little bit like the Raven Guard symbol. I found a little bit of almost a crucifix style cross, and then fill in the edges under each wing of that, so to speak, would look enough like the Raven Guard symbol. Hopefully there'll be some awesome decals out there. And there we have the finished Raven Guard, and again, a nightmare to photograph and to video to really show you what it looks like without holding it in your hands. But hopefully it will give you an idea of how quick and easy it may be to paint a Raven Guard Legion. I hope you've enjoyed the video and found it useful. Maybe it's given you some ideas for painting your own Legions Imperialis miniatures. It's definitely helped me a little bit. I seem to be leaning towards Imperial Fists again. I'm not 100% sure. I do want to do something different. I always seem to do Imperial Fists. So I'll wait until I've done the traitors to fully make up my mind what Legion I'm going to do. But I do hope that it showed you that you can do an awful lot with very, very basic painting techniques, contrast, things like that. Hope you're not put off by the airbrushing. in the video. Like I said earlier on, you can get around all of those things, whether it be a dry brush or a grey prime and then a dry brush. There are methods you can use. You can get very, very similar effects. And I hope you're not put off by the further highlighting of miniatures to this scale. Those are completely optional. And like I said, just a dry brush of some of those colours can work, or you can leave them completely. Take the tutorial for what you need and leave out the stages that you don't. As mentioned earlier, if you have enjoyed the video, please do give us a like. It really helps the video get seen by other people. And if it is your first time visiting the channel, please do check out the other videos. There's lots of things there and lots of painting tutorials, as well as other things on the channel as well. I do have a Patreon for those wanting to support the channel, so please check out the link in the description there. I do have a new and growing Discord as well, so I'd love to see you over there and sharing your own paint jobs. It would be really, really great to chat with you away from the comments on YouTube, which are often hard to do, and share things. Let me know what you think in the comments. What legions are you painting yourself? Maybe you're painting Solar Auxilia. Maybe you're giving the game a miss completely. Maybe you're waiting for the Traitor Legions video, which I'll be working on next after this, and will hopefully be out in a week or so after this one. But thank you very much for watching. Take care, and I'll catch you soon.